Welcome to Play and Pedagogies in the Early Years. This is topic 7. In this topic we're looking at play-based policies again. Specifically we're looking at policies, how they direct our thinking about assessment and documentation. So I've just broken that down into 3 questions really. What is assessment? What is documentation? And then we're going to look at some of the implications for practice in the early years. The background reading for this topic has been written by Glenda McNaughton from the University of Melbourne and Gillian Williams, an early childhood psychologist. As you read this chapter from their text, Techniques for Teaching Young Children, I'd like you to reflect on how or if their theoretical standpoints are evidenced in their writing, and if you can name what these might be. In this chapter, the authors focus on the practice known generically through the early years sectors as documentation. As with other terminology we have come across this so far in the unit, it isn't long before you realise that this term is slippery in that it has many meanings in different contexts, and it varies quite vastly in its application across the sectors. So first, the authors take some time to set up the chapter by defining the what and how of documentation in their specific context. And they point out a particular critique of the widely adopted Reggio approach to documentation. In this section, you'll find your background knowledge of Loris Malaguzzi's theory helpful, as it informs much of this practice. Next, the authors present an overview of the when and why of documentation. In this section, you'll see evidence of the author's different theoretical backgrounds emerging, not to contest each other, but to provide different perspectives and a range of viewpoints or standpoints, and also how these can coexist and provide prisms for critique when reflecting on your practice. Let's return to our primary source to see how the terms assessment and documentation are defined in the EYLF. From this definition, we can see that assessment is an ongoing and informed process of gathering information as evidence about what the children know and can do and understand as part of an ongoing cycle. So from the early years learning framework, assessment is very much a process, and that it's ongoing. The information is gathered to inform teaching and learning, and it's documented in various forms, and that documentation is a collaborative process, and that it requires that documentation and assessment process requires educators to engage in critical reflection. Further, the EYLF points out some elements of assessment policy in the early years settings. It notes that it's important for educators to undertake assessment in partnership with families, children and other professionals in order to plan effectively, to communicate about children's learning, to determine the extent with which the children are progressing to realising the learning outcomes, and importantly, if not, what might be impeding their progress, to identify children who may need additional support, and to evaluate the effectiveness of learning opportunities, the environment and the experiences offered. And interestingly here, that connection to the approaches taken. And it calls on teachers or educators to reflect on their pedagogy and whether or not their approach is suiting the context in which these children find themselves. So it's a fairly comprehensive overview of assessment. Documentation is defined as the recording and creating of evidence of learning, turning the experiences that you observe, hear, see, feel and write, or written into written or pictorial records that can be shared, revisited and extended over time. Now, they qualify rich documentation incorporates multiple perspectives. So there's a fairly strong statement there that this is not a process where the educator sits in a quiet room on his or her own, and with a cup of coffee, and writes down all of the things that comes to their mind about that learning. Multiple perspectives, including the voices of educators, children, peers, families, and other professionals, are encouraged and expected, and that there is an acknowledgement there that the documentation can't cover everything, but it can capture snapshots of the children's learning within a particular activity, within a particular context. Returning to our reading, what then is pedagogical documentation? Because that's the term that's used in the reading by McNaughton and William, and it's not the same term that's used in the EYLF. Pedagogical documentation is defined by the authors as a teaching technique that has strong connections to the Reggio Emilia approach. It allows individuals to revisit and reflect on their learning experiences. So philosophically, pedagogical documentation, as discussed by McNaughton and Williams in the background reading, is aligned with the socio-cultural approaches of Reggio Emilia. And knowing what you know about Reggio Emilia, that will have certain limitations, but also certain opportunities for teachers. In the chapter, the stages or steps involved in pedagogical documentation are explained, and in quite some detail. First, the educator and or children identify a project or activity to be documented and decide on the technique for recording and displaying their observations. So there are many, many ways to do that. It could be through photography, through video, through artwork. The possibilities are endless. It's an open slather approach to documenting, deciding on the technique. After the activity has been recorded, the educators must interpret and organise it in ways that explain the children's learning. And again, we'll just highlight that this is a collaborative process. So it is the educator's responsibility to ensure that's recorded, but in collaboration with others. Significant moments, which you could call evidence within the activity or project, are identified and analysed in greater depth by constructing collaborative comments on what's taken place, which could be transcribing conversations, adding captions to images, raising questions about the teaching and learning that has taken place. So if it was a video of an activity, then you could do some peer reviewing or some ask the children to talk about what they thought was helpful or not helpful in terms of the teaching and learning that's taken place. Interpreting the learning against the outcomes eventually, not always, but mostly there would be some reference to the EYLF outcomes. And then, most importantly, reflecting to inform future teaching and learning. And again, I think sometimes we think about reflection as a very isolated activity, but it doesn't need to be. So that's very important there, and McNaughton and Williams make that point as well. So thinking about the implications for practice, let's look at that process of reflection. This is from the EYLF. It's from a document that draws on the EYLF, written by Melinda Miller for the Gowrie Institute. So critical reflection, she says, is a necessary component of professionalism. Evidence of critical reflection within a service draws attention to the intellectual work of the educators and highlights the professional capacities beyond the care of young children. Early childhood curriculum documents place a strong emphasis on the importance of critically reflective practice, like the Early Years Learning Framework that says ongoing and learning and reflective practice as lists that as one of the 5 key principles of effective practice. So these are the kinds of questions that you engage with when you're thinking critically about practice. Who's disadvantaged when I work this way? Who's advantaged? What are the understandings of each child? What are other theories of knowledge could help me to understand better what I've seen and experienced? Now, again, drawing on Module 1, you'll see a range of theoretical perspectives informing those questions, not the least of which are some critical and post-structural questions there. So moving beyond, if we talk about critical theory, moving beyond the functional and the technical to those critical ways of seeing the world. And this is represented here visually. The layers of reflection. The first layer, the fundamental layer, is thinking about the experience and looking at the knowledge of others. So that's the what, if you like. What's happening here? What am I seeing? And the next layer is thinking about how does literature and what you know about theory inform that work. So how can you interpret that activity through literature and a theoretical lens? So that's the so what. So what's important about this activity? So what should I be taking away from this, or what should I be learning from this experience, and who can help me do that? And the last circle there, considering the implications of broader social and political circumstances, is getting into that critical thinking, that higher order thinking process of thinking about the so what. So what does this mean in terms of my work? What is it about the circumstances in which I work and the circumstances in which this activity has played out that I can take away from that snapshot, that capture, to inform both teaching and learning, but also my understandings of who I am in this context and who the children I'm working with and their parents and families are. So it's beyond just sitting down writing a record of what happened. I think that's the most important point to make here. Also wanted to talk about the implications for assessment. It's an interesting concept, assessment, and you'll remember if you've the reading by Jennifer Sumption and her colleagues that when they were on the writing team for the EYLF, the use of the term assessment was contested. Not an easy word, and certainly not a word that had been in use much in early years in Australia, the pre-compulsory sector anyway, up until the publication of the Early Years Learning Framework in 2009. So, in the EYLF, assessment is described or referred to as a process of gathering and analysing information as evidence. Now, interestingly, it uses the word evidence about what the children know, can do, and understand. It's part of an ongoing cycle that includes planning, documenting, and evaluating children's learning. So, assessment there, there's probably no surprises there. A strong emphasis on it being processual, a process, and that it is about gathering evidence upon which to base judgments. So that ongoing assessment process can include a diverse array of methods. So it's not necessarily the use of the word evidence might take your mind to quantitative kind of evidence, things that you can count and measure. Now that statement's qualified, saying, okay, this evidence can be captured in a range of ways. It can be used to validate the different pathways that the children take. So it's definitely not constrained within any quantitative regimes, if you like. The process is not exclusively on endpoints, and I think that's another very important point in this document, in this policy. We're not talking about children as becomings in this document. Remember, we're just as concerned and interested in the children as beings in that moment, what it is that they're doing in that moment. Yes, we're interested in the distance that they've travelled, where they've come from, and how they're moving along in terms of their growth and learning and development. But it's not solely focused on that. So that's celebrating the small steps, but the giant leaps as well. So again, this emphasis on the use of different strategies to document, organise, synthesize, and interpret information about the children. So there are. It talks about more recent approaches to assessment. They examine the learning strategies. That's that pedagogical documentation that McWilliam and McNaughton and William were talking about. So looking at that, not just about the children's learning, but about what it is you're doing as an educator, and the fact that these are co-constructed with the educator and the child. So that comment is reinforced throughout the document. I just wanted to try and visualise this. It's a little bit crude and linear because it's a very complex process. But in early childhood, so before school settings, assessment is mapped to outcomes. So it generally starts with an activity, followed by the documentation, the reflection, and then the connection to the outcome through that process. And I just want you to hold that in your mind because we'll look at how that happens in schools, which is quite different. So how's assessment discussed or qualified, talked about in the school sector, remembering that the first 3 years of the school sector are encompassed in the early years or cover the early years. So this is an excerpt from the Australian curriculum, and it talks about standards. So achievement standards to identify current levels of learning and achievement. And now, again, it's very much orientated to making judgments about the quality of the learning demonstrated, but it is very much focused on the end period. So even though we talk about school assessment as formative and summative, seems to be a very strong emphasis on the summative process, the assessment of learning, and probably, at least publicly, there seems to be a strong emphasis on that. Any teacher in a school would tell you that there is an awful lot of formative assessment, of course, that goes on a day-to-day basis. So it is probably very as much a ongoing process as it is in the pre-compulsory sector, but it's the end product stuff that seems to be focused on or the attention. So it takes a couple of forms. The ongoing formative assessment for monitoring learning and providing feedback and informing teaching and learning, very similar. Then we have the summative assessment, which is for the purposes of twice yearly reporting by schools to parents and carers. Now that's where the formative evidence is captured, if you like, twice a year to report to parents in what's called an A to E reporting scale. So whether the children are working at or beyond the standards articulated in the policy document, the curriculum document, and that's all done within the particular context of whatever that school setting is. And then you get external measures, so the benchmarking that takes place through norm reference tests, so national norms, not just class norms, but national norms in assessments such as NAPLAN that we know and well. So in schools, again, just using that kind of visual, In schools, assessment is mapped from outcomes. So typically a teacher would start with an outcome from a policy document, whatever the curriculum document may be, document a learning, teaching and learning process, a lesson, then that activity would be taught and there would be some reflection on that lesson. So just again, before I go on with that, just have a look. So I'll come back later to those different processes, but you can see that the difference of the pre-compulsory sector mapping to outcomes and the school sector mapping from outcomes presents, there are some implications for practice, particularly for those of you as early years educators who might be aspiring to work across the sectors, but also in terms of children moving from one sector to the other. We'll talk about that a little bit more. So another interesting thing about assessment is this notion of cohort comparative versus individual assessment. So in this image, you can see a little boy looking at a display of one of his the documentation about a learning experience. It's not very clear, and I apologise for that, but the 5 learning outcomes in the EYLF, the Early Years Learning Framework, are listed there. And in that documentation, which is a blend of photographs and the child's work, the documentation would be picking up which of those outcomes this little boy was working toward, what he was doing, reflecting on his progress. And even though you can't see it quite clearly, part of the documentation is some annotations and scribbles, well, not scribbles, some annotations by this child about what's happening. So it gives a strong impression that this has been a collaborative process with the child himself. So this means that the boy's work or the documentation has been collaborated with his input and displayed for others to see, not put in a filing cabinet, but displayed for parents to talk and other educators to see and comment on and talk about. And so it's a very overt process. This is actually I should go back. So it's also it's important to notice that so this is an assessment, but it's just about this one boy and it's not in comparison to what anyone else is doing in that room. So it's about his work, his progress against those outcomes, or how he's working toward those outcomes, what the teachers or the educator sees him doing in isolation of everyone around him. So it's individual. In this example, and this is taken from the Australian curriculum, this is a kindergarten, early stage 1 work sample. So actually it's not from the Australian curriculum, it's from the New South Wales Board of Studies, sorry. So you can see on the top of this template that it's an English activity, and specifically it's a text type called a recount, and that this child has been assessed as being at the expected standard. So the activity would have been a blank template, a box like that, and all of the children in the class would have been asked to write a recount to recall a recent event in their, whatever, might have been school holidays, whenever it happened, or the excursion actually, a recount of the excursion. So we can assume that all of the children went on the excursion and are all sitting down to write a recount pretty much all at the same time or thereabouts. The teacher has clarified, for future reference no doubt, and to show the child how to model the correct writing of the words. So where it's not quite so clear what the child's saying, the teacher has transcribed the text there, and you can see there's a comment on the right-hand side that the teacher's talking about the use of past tense, good control, directionality of writing, and those comments, as well as the grade comment, which we'll look at in a minute, relate to the outcomes from that policy document down listed down the bottom. Now, the teacher's comment there is quite comprehensive in terms of what Jodie can and can't do against those outcomes. And in this template work sample, the teacher has made a judgment about Jodie's work and judged that she is working at expected standard. Now, to make a comment like that, the teacher would have moderated that sample across the cohort, the entire class, and maybe if there were two early stage 1 classes at the school, then it would be across the both cohorts in consultation with another teacher. So it's very specifically against the standards are very specifically noted and identified against each of those outcomes. It's a much more I guess I'm not being judgmental, but I'm probably saying it's a less of an open process than the comparison of the early childhood, the early years. So there you've got this child being compared comparatively with everybody else in the class, and in the previous example, this little boy being compared to no one, just on his own efforts and endeavours. Now, it's interesting to think about that child could be 4.5 or 5 in an early childhood setting, and Jodie could also be 4.5 or 5 in a school setting. Yet, the way that we judge their progress is quite different. Just hold that thought. So I guess my question to you then, or thought, prompt, provocation around this topic is to look at play-based policies, and particularly this concept of assessment and documentation, and think about concepts like continuity of learning. If we've got early childhood settings mapping to outcomes on an individual basis, and we've got schools mapping from outcomes in a cohort comparative basis, what implications does that have for our practice? What implications does it have for the projected trajectory of success for children moving across and between these settings and their families? I acknowledge that this is a fairly simplistic overview of a very complex task, but it does highlight, I think, some of the significant differences between the sectors and between policies across the sectors within that spectrum that we call early years. So I'd like you to put on your critical post-structural hat at the moment and consider these questions. In light of what we know and understand about those policies to this point, how is power evidenced in the two processes? Whose voices are privileged and whose are not? Does that differ across the sectors? How and might, or how do or might, these policies privilege or marginalise families and children, teachers? How do the different policies influence practice? How is continuity of learning addressed across the sectors through these policies? How will you, as a professional, deal with the differences across the sectors as articulated in these policies? If you see inconsistencies, illogical practices, what will you do, what can you do to speak back to the authorities responsible for their creation? Finally, I want to draw your attention to this video. As you listen to this educator's account of planning and documentation, again, I'd ask you to think about the links that she's making to the NQS and consider the implications this accreditation and quality assurance process has for your role as an educator. In summary, play-based assessment and documentation policies are informed by theory, practice and context. Assessment and documentation are aligned to outcomes, but remain very much a subjective process. Assessment and documentation, like teaching and learning across the early years sectors, vary, and this has significant implications for continuity of learning. Assessment is a contested term and its meaning varies across the sectors. These are the references I've drawn on for this lecture.